Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Dulder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and it's wonderful to see all of you here this afternoon and for some this evening. 31 years ago today, the Berlin Wall fell on the 9th of November, 1989, and last month we celebrated the 30th anniversary of Germany's reunification. And that's what we're going to talk about in the conversation we're about to have. But before I turn to our speakers, we're grateful to everyone, and especially our members, for joining us for this historic discussion and timely conversation on the uncertain future of Germany and Europe in a post-Merkel political landscape. The Council, as you know, is an independent, nonpartisan platform, and I want to underscore that the views expressed on this platform are those of the individuals themselves and not of the host or of the Council. As always, you can participate in this conversation if you want by going to type into your browser ccga.live, ask a question there or vote for one of the questions that have already been asked. And about 30 minutes from now, we'll turn to those questions and have a conversation in that way. But before we do, let me welcome our two speakers. Constanze Stelzenmüller is a senior fellow on foreign policy at the Brookings Institution's Center on the United States and Europe. Many of you have seen Constanze in person when we've hosted her a number of times in Chicago. And Ambassador Wolfgang Ischinger is the chairman of the Munich Security Conference, formerly served as state secretary from 1998 to 2001, and as Germany's ambassador to the United States from 2001 to 2006. Wolfgang has a new book out called World in Danger, Germany and Europe in Uncertain Times. And you can purchase that book from our local Chicago book partner by clicking on the link that is available either on the event web page or which will shortly appear in the Zoom chat function. Wolfgang and Constanze, thank you so much for joining us here today. Wonderful to have you. Wolfgang from Germany and Constanze from Washington, D.C. Let's start with the news that has preoccupied so much of this country, but also, of course, so much of the world. And Wolfgang, let me start with you. It took a while for the votes to be counted. In fact, some counting is still going on, and for the presidential election to be concluded. But we now have a president-elect in Joe Biden. How is Germany reacting to this news?
Well, Ivo, first of all, thank you so much for hosting us tonight. It's a privilege for me to participate in this. Well, to respond to your question, I think we're all suffering from sleepless nights. It is an amazing phenomenon for me to see how Germans, and I think it's true also for most of our neighbors, how we sort of continue to watch television through the night because of the 6 hours time differential, etc., as if we were electing the president of the United States. Actually, we are not, but we understand that the implications of who is going to be the next president of the United States have such an enormous meaning for the future of Europe, the future of global society, that it's amazing how to what extent this issue, your elections, have absolutely dominated everybody's discussions over the last week or so. And I think now most people are sighing a sigh of relief, looking at the preliminary results, at the unofficial results. And here's the point I'd like to make. What I see around Berlin, and what I see also, and what I hear among the comments made by some of our friends and partners, I see a lot of euphoria, which is understandable, given the difficulties, this very difficult period that we have had for the last 4 years. And I've been, when I had an opportunity over the last several days, I've been trying to warn people, now don't start to be too euphoric. We in Europe, and that's my initial message, I think, we need to do our homework. We cannot now sit back and believe that some kind of transatlantic paradise organized by Joe Biden will reappear, and we don't need to do anything about it. I think there is a huge amount of work to be done, contributions to be offered by Europe for a US president who faces, as I understand, huge challenges, not only with regard to the pandemic, but the list of international and domestic challenges is obviously an impressive one. And in other words, we on the European side, we should try to be a meaningful partner and not just a partner that demands to be protected and cuddled. We need to try to make a more meaningful contribution in the future.
I want to get back to how to do that and what that means, Wolfgang. I think those are important points. Constanze, as one of those unique people who has spent a lot of the last many years on this side of the Atlantic, but of course knows that other side of the Atlantic, Germany in particular, but Europe as well, and have been an observer, close observer of transatlantic relations. How do you interpret the euphoric moment? I mean, bells being sung in Paris, and all the congratulations that are coming over. And do you share Wolfgang's word of caution that some things may in fact appear to be less changed or more difficult to change than might appear at first glance when the news hits CNN and therefore the world at 11:25 p.m. a.m. On Saturday morning?
Well, thank you very much, Ivo, for inviting me to this discussion on this momentous anniversary. As you said, I've been living here for just 6 years now, and this is the third time that I'm living in this country. And I'm here on one of those evil H-1B visas. I don't even have a green card, much less American citizenship. And I will say to you that it occasionally in the last 4 years did feel a little bit as though I was an enemy alien. And that, that was occasionally unpleasant. And at exactly 11:25 on Saturday morning, when NPR said that the AP had called the election for President-elect Biden, everybody in my historically Black neighborhood, now pretty mixed neighborhood in central DC in Columbia Heights, rushed out in front of their houses on their porches and started banging pots and pans and cheering, and the cars were honking, and there was and even an hour later when I went to market, people were still standing around on corners randomly cheering. And everybody was wearing a huge grin. So, Washington obviously is a deep blue city, always has been, with all its federal workers. And as one of the magnet cities of the great migration northwards from the South in the 30s and 40s. But still, I think the relief is everywhere. And I think it's, this isn't so much about policies, but about, the end of cruelty, incivility, and incompetence, which hit people at every walk of life, and I think was, just made people unhappy. And if you looked at the speeches by Biden and Kamala Harris a couple days ago, it was just so clear that there was going to be a return to civility. That, I think, is really worth noting, even as we acknowledge that the world has changed, and not just because of Donald J. Trump. I mean, he was both a symptom and a cause. But this 46th American president will take office, and I think it's pretty clear that he will take office in January, in a world in which the meaning of American power has changed considerably. And I understand Wolfgang's caveats, but I thought it was notable, looking at the responses, certainly of our key politicians, the chancellor herself in her video message, and also the foreign minister, Heiko Maas, how how and in even before the election, a couple of speeches and pieces by the defense minister, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, how they have all together emphasized the importance of Europe and Germany taking up more of the slack for security provision in Europe's periphery from Northern Africa up to the Baltic. And I think that message, has been heard loud and clear. And this is not just, hedging or hedging against 2024 or anything else. I think there is a genuine understanding that we're living in a world where Europe has to do more. And I'll tell you why. We understand that there has got to be a different division of labor with America for this to work. But there is also, I think, an understanding in Berlin that there will be, while we will want to collaborate more with this administration, there will also be things on which we will want to disagree. And we have to earn the right to disagree.
Nice phrase. Earn the right to disagree. I like that. Let me step back, because we will come back to this conversation, which is a really important conversation about the future. But I want to spend a little time on the past, and let's start with Angela Merkel, who has announced that she's stepping down as chancellor next year after what will then be 16 years in power. Her relationship, of course, with Donald Trump was never easy from day one, and I think that's the diplomatic understatement of the day. But let's focus not on her relationship per se with different presidents. She had a very good relationship with Barack Obama and an okay relationship with George W. Bush. But she was and is a major figure in Europe and in Germany herself. Wolfgang, talk a little bit about the kinds of contributions looking back over that 16-year period that she has made in helping to bring Europe to perhaps the place that it now needs to be on taking on that greater degree of responsibility around the world. What's her accomplishment? How do you look at that?
That's a great question. Well, one thing that's remarkable about Chancellor Merkel, I think, is that it is possible to believe that she has not spent a lot of time thinking about her legacy. She is the kind of person who will credibly say, well, I leave that to historians. Let them decide what role I played. And from what I can see, she is conducting herself now, less than a year away from her departure, from her predicted or announced departure in the fall of next year. She is behaving in much the same way that she has behaved for the last 15 and a half years. Point one. Point two, I forget which British Prime Minister said, when he was asked what actually drives your vision, your foreign policy, and his response was events, my boy, events. Now, that's also true for, it's actually true for most of our countries. We may have had large visions 10, 15 years ago, but we've been preoccupied mostly with short-term crisis management. In the case of Germany, within 2 years of her arrival, Angela Merkel was confronted with the financial crisis that broke out in 2008. And then, of course, we had the Greek crisis and we had the Euro crisis. And when that appeared to be more or less, under control, let me put it that way, then, the migration crisis erupted. And before that, we had, of course, Libya and Fukushima and the abandoning by Germany of nuclear power, and then the migration crisis and everything that followed. So, in other words, this did not really go according to plan. There was a lot of short-term crisis management involved, and I'm not sure whether most Germans would agree with what I'm saying now, but I think with the exception of her handling of the migration crisis and the nuclear power thing, most Germans would probably say that she's actually handled this very well. We feel comfortable about it. She has not made serious mistakes. I say with the exception of the migration crisis, because that has produced, as I'm sure you know and others know, that has produced a significant segment of our voters who have since 2015 decided to hate Angela Merkel, and who are saying that they will be very happy when she leaves. I think many of them will probably regret having said that, because I'm a little less certain that whoever is going to succeed her a year from now is going to be capable of doing this in the same kind of cool, unexcited, rational manner that she has conducted herself. Having said that, final remark, there's one point of criticism that I would offer. She has not been bold, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, when boldness offered itself as an opportunity because of the advances that, for example, Emmanuel Macron proposed, not only to her, but to the leadership of the European Union, trying to take the European project into a next stage. Angela Merkel has not taken the risk of proposing disruptive, qualitative jumps. That is probably the one area where I would say it would have been so great if on the basis of her relatively solid majority, if she had tried to join forces with Emmanuel Macron 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and tried to create what we are now actually creating as a consequence of the pandemic crisis, namely the ability of the European Union to be a little more sovereign. I mean, now the EU actually can take up debt, at least on this, initially on this one issue, the pandemic fund, which we're creating. But that, of course, is an important step, which for many, many years, my country in particular, would have refused to accept. So we are moving forward, but we've been moving forward maybe less dramatically, with less determination than could have been possible. That would be my principal criticism. But when you look at the polling data, a year before her departure, Angela Merkel is regarded by a vast majority of Germans as a kind of reinsurance phenomenon. She makes sure that nothing terrible will happen, and she still enjoys a lot of support. It will be hard for whoever is going to to get this job to fill her shoes. They'll turn out to be rather big shoes.
Constanze, how do you assess the legacy in the same way? A very competent crisis manager that deals with the crises well, but not a visionary, not a bold thinker. How do you see it?
Well, this is a complicated question, and it much hinges on the way you define greatness or a good chancellor. And policy wonks like us, I think, have an inbuilt bias towards people who are visionary and are good at public political rhetoric. In which case, your best president ever was Barack Obama, who I think in many ways was a great president, but you could definitely disagree with him on policies and on execution. With Merkel, I tend to think that the assessing her record, I mean, I come down on her to say in my net assessment is yet is that, yes, she was a great chancellor, but that several of her most significant decisions have had significant downsides. And because I don't want to go over the same ground as Wolfgang, let me offer a couple of other points here. One, she inherited a Christian Democratic Party, the center-right German Popular Party, that had been completely demoralized by a party scandal, a party financing scandal in the late era of Kohl, that showed that the party was in dire need of a thorough cleanup and modernization. And she proceeded to do this. In fact, I think few chancellors have, or few party heads in Germany have undertaken so ruthless a modernization of their parties as she has in the post-war period. But she did it in a style of with a style of governance that was seen as, that was deliberately depoliticizing. This was known as asymmetric demobilization. The idea was to, and this is taking a leaf out of the book of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair before her, to triangulate the CDU into the middle. And we have to say it worked. It worked. It really, it catapulted an old, overaged party riven by scandal into modernity, it has to be said. But it also had, I think, some unintended side effects that have proven very problematic, not the least of which is that it left open the, in the past, tightly patrolled right-wing flank of the CDU, and squeezed the Social Democrats against the left wall of Germany's political spectrum. Now, you could say the Social Democrats, are grown-ups and ought to be able to reinvent themselves, and they've struggled to do this. In many ways, they're a deeply divided party today, struggling with their own modernization issues. But the vacuum on the right, of course, left room for the AfD to enter into. And her decision to not close Germany's borders, not to open them, to not close them in September 2015, I think was both right in humanitarian terms and right in terms of European policy, because if she had closed the borders, this would have led to a blockage from the Balkans all the way up to the Austrian-German border and created public order crises in public economies that were a lot weaker than Germany's. We were the country best placed in Europe to take in that quantity of refugees, and as we know now, we have integrated them quite well. But it's also correct to say that this turned the AfD from a sort of, a mildly Eurosceptical, professorial Eurosceptic party into a raging ethno-nationalist, xenophobic party that got up to nearly 28% in one East German state alone. It's plateauing again now, but it's not gone. And I think that what we're seeing now, and I think Merkel has understood that she needed to be a part of this and that she needed to lead this, is a repoliticization of German debate in the context of the pandemic and the European crisis that it has contributed to causing. But the fragmentation of Germany's political space remains, and we will see in the federal elections next year, when Merkel steps down, probably a situation where it is no longer possible to have two-party coalitions, and we may have to have three-party coalitions for the foreseeable future, leading to greater instability and less reliability for Germany externally from the point of view of its neighbors and allies. I'm sorry, that was a long explanation, and I'll leave it at this domestic point, but that was one that Wolfgang didn't raise.
No, I think it's complementary and to what Wolfgang had, and excellent as a way to think about Germany's domestic political role going forward, and perhaps not having that strong ability to be a strong leader, which leads me, Wolfgang, to the issue of Europe and the future of Europe. I share with you the warning, and speaking as someone just like all of us truly believe in the strength of the transatlantic relationship, but the warning that the idea that Joe Biden is just going to come back and rebuild the transatlantic relationship as if nothing has happened, it's just not realistic, even if he'd want to. And his desire, and you know the president-elect as well as anyone, he regular at the Munich Security Conference, both as vice president and since. And so he cares deeply about this relationship, but there's so much to be done here at home with COVID, the economic crisis, the racial crisis, everything else. In some ways, the success of the transatlantic relationship depends less on what the U.S. is going to do and more on what Europe is going to do. And the era of waiting for the United States to lead and to tell Europe what to do may, frankly, be coming to an end. And the era of a more balanced partnership where we, as Constanze said, have the right to disagree, the ability to stand in that way is critical. What confidence, or how do you see Europe getting to that point, particularly a Europe that in the EU no longer has Britain as a member, that remains divided between East and West and North and South and different priorities, and may lack a strong German leader to bring it all together in some ways? How, if you were advising European leaders, which you do quietly, how do you think they should go about that?
That's a great question, Ivo. Before I try to offer a response to that, just one footnote to our earlier discussion and to what Constanze said about the German situation. I think it's important to remember that even as we look at this awful right-wing party, the so-called AfD, and of course we also continue to have a left-wing post-communist party, if you compare the challenge that these parties offer to the political stability of Germany, you find that this is actually a minor problem if you compare this, for example, to the situation in France, in our important neighbor. Emmanuel Macron, when I last looked at the polling data, he has a serious problem. He will probably, when he is up for re-election, he will face a competitor by the name of, Madame Le Pen, who, according to the polls, would win the election if they were held today. Now, the situation may change, but the point I'm trying to make is Germany has no such challenge. Even if, and of course Constanze is right, even if German parties are going to be forced into a three-party coalition that may be difficult to manage, et cetera, but it will not need to include either the right wing or the left wing. So in other words, we are speaking in relative terms, of course, we are going to be, that's my prediction, relatively stable. And of course, that is good news. We don't know who is going to be the next chancellor, but I predict that the country can be governed and that the right wing or left wing challenge can be managed. Now, what about Europe? I wish I could be really optimistic. But if I want to be realistic, I have to again offer a note of caution. What we now see is a lot of rhetoric from the EU Commission, from heads of state, from heads of government, from political parties. Yes, Europe needs to get our act together. Remember, in 2014, at the Munich Security Conference, with significant popular and media reaction, then President Joachim Gauck spoke of the need for Germany to take more responsibility. That was before Brexit. It was before the election of Donald Trump in the United States. It was before Chinese foreign policy turned out to be far more, whatever the word is, aggressive or forward-leaning. It was before it was even before the annexation of Crimea. That happened at the end of March 2014. So you would assume that this plea for more responsibility would have resonated very, very strongly in the months and years that followed, because crises multiplied, and the European Union was under threat. And because of the election of Donald Trump, even NATO was under threat. So you would assume that the 2014 wake-up call would have been repeated and strengthened, etc. Actually, when I look at it critically, I would say, yes, we have taken certain decisions that point us in the right direction, but have we really taken more responsibility globally? Well, not really. And so I'm a little skeptical whether the great rhetoric that you now hear from all sorts of quarters in Brussels and certainly in Berlin and elsewhere, that yes, now we need to be a better partner for the United States. I wonder to what extent that will be supported by, the commitment of resources. That's what politics is all about. Will we put our money where our mouth is? What about defense expenditures, to start with the most obvious issue? What about our ability to coordinate with the United States on China? Can we speak with one voice? No, we can't. We have not even been capable so far of agreeing a text that would deserve to be called an EU, strategic paper on China. There is a paper that's now almost 2 years old that speaks of China as a systemic rival, but that's not a strategy. That's just a notion. So, I repeat what I said in the very beginning. We need to do our homework. We need to take it far more seriously, and I'm worried that the Biden election will actually be interpreted as by many in Europe that it's not so urgent now as it seemed to be during the Trump era, and that we can go back to sleep. That would be the worst possible outcome. So I would hope that whoever is going to be your next Secretary of State or Defense will actually travel to Europe rather quickly and tell Europeans that you're going to play hardball with them, because otherwise they will go back to sleep. So we need a serious discussion about the division of labor and about what you expect of Europe, what you, United States, expect of Europe. There is a willingness now to listen, and there is a willingness to change, but there are enormous obstacles within the current German coalition and in other partner countries. So I see for the next year or so, I see a very interesting period of transatlantic discussions and negotiations and deliberations, but I don't think it's going to be, an easy walk. I think it's going to be really hard work.
Constanze, Europeans taking on more of the burden in order to take on more of the responsibility collectively is what is it that the United States could do under a Biden administration to help bring that about, if it is not going to help come organically from within, or perhaps you think it will come organically from within?
So I wouldn't be quite as severe as Wolfgang on this point. I think that public rhetoric is important because it shapes voters' expectations. And I think it's necessary for German politicians to tell the electorate in Germany that the world has changed, and that we need to do more. And I think this is preparing the ground for greater commitment and resources. I see all the obstacles to that as does Wolfgang, but I do also think that there is a genuine tone, a genuine shift in urgency in the German debate. What to advise the the Biden administration? Thankfully, I think, as we all know, the Biden team, the transition team, is enormous, and it is particularly enormous in the field of foreign and security policy. It's literally a cast of thousands, but there are, I think, a lot of people that we all know, and that we know Europe and Germany well. This is a good thing. They have their own interlocutors. And even if, we'll see the same undignified spectacle that we saw 8 years ago or before that, of sort of confirmation hearings holding up, the blandest of appointees, we know that enough people have their own networks to be able to start talking with each other, which is important because history ain't waiting for us. And it's certainly not waiting for Senate confirmation hearings. I think that I think we all know on both sides that we're looking at a scenario where we have adversaries and competitors with whom we will need to occasionally collaborate, and that we have allies with whom we are at the same time competing, but who are not, and this is different from the Trump administration, our adversaries, or to quote the president, our foes, right? So the challenge of the age is to manage these relationships. And between America and Europe, it is also going to be competition and alliance. But the difference, it's not just collaboration on, on a point by point and issues and reluctantly, but it's a genuine alliance. And the question is, how do we recalibrate the burdens of that alliance in a way that serves both America and Europe? And I think that there are a lot of areas of agreement. And even on areas where we have disagreed in the past, such as the advisability of letting the Russians and the Chinese buy up physical and digital infrastructure in Europe, I think I see a change in European and indeed in German attitudes. I think that the German strategic community is pretty much in agreement at this point that Nord Stream 2 really wasn't a great idea, and certainly isn't just an economic project, and that handing over our 5G network to Huawei, a state-backed enterprise, maybe also not so great. So I actually think that there is a great deal of, that we could find a great deal of common ground, where even if we don't have 100% alignment, we can find a compromise solution. And let me just to put this, to put this in concrete terms, it was really counterproductive, stupid, to sort of want to bully the Germans, to pound the Germans into the ground over Nord Stream 2, and essentially say the German government should exercise the right of eminent domain and have these pipelines ripped out of the ground. Otherwise, we will sanction you to death. This is, would have occasioned, as we know from Germany walking out of nuclear energy in 2011, would have led to lawsuits in the billions of euros. That's not something anybody can afford. It's a mistake. I hate the pipeline, but that's not the way to do this. The way to do this is to Europeanize the legal regime that applies to the pipeline. That helps us to, take off the arms of the Russian octopus one by one. And the next step, obviously, is to make sure that there are cast iron guarantees for storage and reverse flows, not just for our eastern neighbors in the EU and in NATO, but also for Ukraine. Okay, that's a constructive way to resolve this, that takes the heat out of this, and also delivery of American LNG to Germany. But for 3 senators to write to the mayor of the port town of Sassnitz on the Baltic and say, you will never wake up, without crying again once we're finished with you, it's really not a helpful way to do this kind of thing. And I'm hoping the Biden administration will not do that. So I'm fairly confident that we can find ways of resolving what hitherto have seemed to be completely unworkable issues. And also, not least, because we've all had the fear of God put into us by the combination of the Trump administration and the pandemic.
And Ivo, can I add a little anecdote to this sanction discussion that Constanze just offered? It's actually in my book. I mean, I'm not telling the story in order to provoke interest in the book, but I think it's an interesting little anecdote. Here we go. When Angela Merkel came to Washington for her first visit after having been elected chancellor, this was in January of 2006, she sat down with President Bush in the Oval Office, and I was there with her because I was the ambassador at the time. And in the course of this initial discussion, which of course covered many issues, he started a discussion about Iran. Remember, this was 2006. We were far from agreeing on a joint approach to Iran. That was much later, leading to the JCPOA. So President Bush said, "So, what do you think about sanctions against Iran?" And she said, in so many words, she said, "Sanctions, it's a very interesting thing. Remember, when I was growing up as a kid in the former GDR, my family was not necessarily a fan of the Soviet nomenclatura. So whenever the United States took some action against the Soviet leadership, occasionally in terms of sanctions, we essentially, my dad, who was a Protestant minister, secretly applauded. But when these US sanctions against the Soviet Union led to the fact that we could no longer buy any bananas in our local grocery store in Templin, we asked ourselves, why are we being punished? What has this to do with us here in this remote corner? The fun part of this is her hometown of Templin is literally only miles away from the port of Sassnitz, which is the one that these three senators wanted to sanction. So my bottom line would be, sanctions can be a very interesting instrument of foreign policy, as agreed by Angela Merkel and George W. Bush more than a decade ago. But you don't want to sanction your friends. I think that's a very bad idea.
Well, that's, of course, a message loud and clear to the next administration, because that may be a change in policy if there are no sanctioning of the friends. We have only really 2 minutes left, and I wanted to get at least one question in from our listeners and viewers, and that has to do with the Schengen Agreement, and the question of Schengen is, it was under stress because of COVID. It may now be under stress because of the attacks in France and Austria. How can the Schengen Agreement, which is at the core of what Europe thinks it is and wants to be, is it in danger of falling apart? Or, Wolfgang, do you still see it as something that is manageable in the new environment that we're living in?
I think Schengen is an enormously important achievement. We will, I'm sure, we will be able to maintain it. There are important challenges. Of course, the biggest one was during the migration crisis, when we found that the Schengen construction was a kind of a fair weather construction, where we had not taken precautionary measures to provide for the time when the rain would come down. And all of a sudden, we should have known that the idea that each and every country with an outside border, that the idea that all these countries would then protect their part of the EU outside border with their resources, that was a lot of wishful thinking. Which we found out, when Greece and others turned out to be unable to protect the borders. So what we're now doing in that regard is to bolster our collective ability to protect the Schengen borders by creating such institutions as Frontex, which is a collective border security troop, a body, an institution. So I think the lesson we're learning is that all of these European institutions, whether it's Schengen, whether it's the Euro, whether it's other arrangements, we need to make sure that they have enough resilience built in, and that they are not only built for fair weather times, but they are crisis resistant. And that was not the case with Schengen, but we're working on it, and we will maintain it. One problem, finally, that has stood in the way, of course, of more effective cooperation in terms of crime prevention, terrorism, fighting terrorism, etc., has been data protection, privacy considerations. That is a continuing issue. It's also actually a big issue in working with the pandemic threat. And I think this will be a continuing challenge for Europe in finding the right balance between protecting the privacy demands of the individuals and still have an effective procedure to find terrorists, even if they are not identified by our friends from US intelligence agencies, which very often, more often than not, has been the case, that we were happy to have to get a tip off or to get information which we ourselves were unable to get because of our restrictive legislation. We need to rely on Americans. That's not a good system. We need to rely on your people in the future also, but we need to become more resilient in transborder crime. Absolutely. Actually, I wrote a couple of years ago, why don't we create in Europe something that looks and smells like the American FBI? When you created the FBI, a number of states didn't like the idea at all because it looked like an infringement on states' rights. That is the exact same discussion we have in the EU. Individual states don't want a transborder police organization, but maybe we need it.
And that, unfortunately, will be the last word. Wolfgang, thank you so much for joining us this evening in your time. Constanze, wonderful to have you as well. To
pleasure.
Remember Wolfgang's book, Europe, Germany, Europe, and an Uncertain Era, is available from our booksellers. Always good to go to the bookseller and support our local small bookseller. And if you do it by buying Wolfgang's book, you're doing two people a favor. Wolfgang, Constanze, thanks so much for a really fantastic conversation, and look forward to seeing you soon on the screen once again. Take care.